Good evening. It's time to unwind, settle in, and let your thoughts drift away into a slower, simpler world. Tonight, we'll take a journey not filled with excitement or suspense, but with quiet observations, uneventful moments, and the soft hum of history unfolding at a calm and sleepy pace. If your eyes feel heavy, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to stay awake for all of it. Just listen, breathe slowly, and let yourself drift. Let's begin. Part 1: The Abbey Before Dawn. The stones of the abbey had held their silence through centuries, worn smooth by wind, rain, and the soft footsteps of monks long gone. In the quietest hour before dawn, the walls stood cool and still, absorbing the darkness like ancient parchment left unturned. No candles had yet been lit. The corridors held a dim, bluish-gray light that came from the moonlight sneaking through the stained glass windows, not in colors, but in soft patterns of shadow. The air smelled faintly of old incense and cold stone. Brother Edric, the keeper of the bells, stirred in his cell. He never used an alarm, for his body had grown used to waking just before the bell was due to ring. He sat up slowly, allowing his feet to find the chilled floor, and reached for his robe that hung from a wooden peg. The fabric was rough, heavy, but familiar. With no urgency, he walked across the corridor. Each footstep echoed faintly, as if not wanting to disturb the dreams still lingering in the rooms. He paused briefly at the window, gazing at the mist that blanketed the courtyard. Not quite fog, not quite clear, just that sleepy, muffled air that comes before sunrise. His hand found the key to the bell tower. The iron was cold, and it clicked gently as he turned it. The hinges creaked, not rudely, but like an old friend saying good morning with a stiff yawn. And so, before the world was truly awake, Brother Edric began his slow ascent of the tower steps, one at a time. Part 2: The Bell Tower Steps. The steps of the bell tower were not uniform. Some were slightly higher than others, worn into irregular dips by generations of sandals and bare feet. Brother Edric knew each creak, each cold patch, each breath of air that came through the narrow slits in the stone. He carried no candle. The light from the moon above filtered faintly through the tower's open slats, creating a patchwork of silver and shadow that moved only as the wind stirred. Each step he took was steady. He did not rush. There was no need. The morning prayer bell was not to be rung for another 15 minutes. And besides, there was comfort in the slow climb, in feeling the cool stone beneath his hand on the railing, in hearing the muted sound of the wooden trapdoor above. Near the halfway point, Edric paused. He always did, not out of fatigue, but out of habit. From that small landing, he could look out over the cloister garden. It was a quiet view, geometric hedges trimmed too early in the season, a few stone benches slick with dew, and the dark silhouettes of trees still clinging to the last of their leaves. The wind found its way in again, a gentle current, not cold, but insistent, brushing against his cheeks and making his robe sway ever so slightly. Somewhere far below, a raven called once, then silence again. And so he continued, one step, then another, until the wooden beams of the tower's upper platform began to reveal themselves in the shadows above. The bell waited, unmoved, suspended, and silent. Part 3: The Morning Bell. The bell tower was not grand, but it stood tall enough to see the low hills beyond the village wall. The wooden platform creaked under Brother Edric's feet as he reached the top, his hand still resting lightly on the stone railing from the final step. The bell itself, a broad bronze shape dusted with cobwebs, hung motionless above him. Its rope, looped and frayed from years of quiet use, dangled from the pulley like a sleeping snake. Edric didn't ring it right away. He never did. The moments before the bell were his favorite, a hush that felt deeper than silence. The birds had not yet begun their calls. The village remained still. Even the wind seemed to wait. He took a deep breath. The air up there smelled of wood beams, old iron, and the faintest trace of distant chimneys, not yet lit. From the tower window, he could just make out the abbey's cloister roof below. It was damp with dew. Beyond that, the vegetable garden, still in shadows, lay quiet, rows of cabbage and leek, unmoving in the faint breeze. The bell rope felt rough in his hand. He didn't pull it hard, just enough. Just one slow ring to start the day. The sound rolled out gently, not loud, not jarring, just along. round note that floated across the grounds, through the cloister, over the walls, and into the slow morning beyond. He waited, one full breath, then another ring, and then silence again. Brother Edric stood beside the bell for a moment longer, letting the echo fade into the corners of the tower. It was time to descend. Part 4: The Descent. The descent from the bell tower was slower than the climb, though not for any reason beyond rhythm. Brother Edric always took his time on the way down. The morning had officially begun, but only just, and there was no need to hurry. Each step creaked the way it always had, as if the stones were exhaling beneath him. He kept his hand on the railing, not for support, but for the quiet comfort of contact, of feeling something unchanged beneath his palm. The light had shifted, slightly. The gray of the sky was loosening, showing hints of a faded blue. The shadows on the stairs moved just a little with it, softer now, like watercolor brushed gently over stone. At the bottom of the stairs, the wooden door had swung slightly ajar from the breeze. Edric closed it without force, letting it settle into place with a soft clunk. The latch, worn and stubborn, clicked after a second attempt. He returned the key to its hook beside the chapel door. It was an old ritual, unspoken and unquestioned. No one else ever touched the bell tower key. It was his, and had been for nearly 27 years. Down the corridor, he could hear the soft stirrings of others, a cough behind one door, the sound of a robe being drawn from its peg behind another. The monastery was awakening, gently, like the warming sky outside. Edric moved toward the washroom, not hurried, not dragging, just walking, with the pace of someone who had walked these halls every morning of every season. For decades, at the wash basin, he cupped water in his hands. It was cold, as expected, but it shocked him a little all the same. It always did. Some things, he thought, were best left unchanged. The first bell had rung. The others would follow soon. But for now, the quiet remained. Part 5: The Bread Room. The smell came before the sound, as Brother Edric passed beneath the low stone arch into the eastern corridor. A faint warmth met him, not from the morning sun, but from the small oven room tucked behind the kitchen. The scent of bread, not yet fully risen, hung in the air like a quiet promise. The bread room, as it was simply called, had one window, small, square, and usually fogged by its own breath. It let in just enough light to reveal the flour dust floating like soft snowflakes. The room was never loud. It didn't need to be. Its work was patient. Brother Tomas was already there. He always was. Tall, quiet, and slow-moving. He stirred the dough in wide circles with a wooden spoon polished smooth by time. He did not look up when Edric entered. He rarely did. He simply nodded once, barely noticeable. Edric moved to the back of the room, where the round loaves from yesterday had been placed on a wooden rack. Cooled, crusted, and wrapped in soft linen, they waited to be carried to the refectory. One of them was slightly misshapen. Not ruined, just uneven. Edric picked that one up and placed it gently in a wicker basket with the others. Imperfection had never bothered him much. In the corner, the oven's fire had been reduced to a quiet glow. It needed no roaring flames, just enough heat to wake the dough slowly, without hurry. Even the fire seemed to understand the pace of the monastery. As Edric prepared to leave with the basket, Brother Tomas spoke, softly, without turning. "Cool air today." Edric nodded. "It'll stay that way, I think." No further words were needed. He stepped back into the corridor, the warmth of the oven fading behind him, the scent of flour and fire clinging to his robe. The loaves would be sliced soon. But not yet. Part 6: The Refectory Awakens. The refectory smelled faintly of old wood, candle wax, and morning chill. Brother Edric entered through the side door, his footsteps hushed by the worn stone floor, smooth from generations of sandals passing in the same direction. The long wooden tables stretched down the hall in quiet symmetry, each paired with matching benches, slightly bowed from years of patient use. It was still early. Only 2 lamps had been lit, placed on either end of the room. Their light was soft, golden, and flickered lazily against the whitewashed walls. Dust hung gently in the air, catching the glow like morning fog caught by a rising sun. Edric placed the basket of bread on the nearest serving table. The cloth covering the loaves shifted slightly as he did, revealing the rounded tops beneath, some smooth, some cracked, each one shaped by quiet hands. A few monks had begun to trickle in. They moved slowly, not out of reluctance, but in reverence for the stillness of the hour. No one spoke. Voices were reserved for prayer and necessity. This silence was part of the rhythm, as familiar as the sound of the bell or the chill of the basin water. Brother Alwyn, the youngest of the group, bowed his head as he passed Edric. He looked barely awake, eyes heavy, robe slightly askew. Edric gave a small nod in return, not quite a greeting. More like a silent acknowledgement of morning's wait. Wooden bowls and cups were already set out from the night before, arranged with care along the tables. Nothing elaborate, just enough for what was needed. As Edric stepped back to the doorway, he took a last glance at the room. Still half in shadow, still slow to stir, but with warmth building. Quietly, as the light found its way in. And then he turned, not with purpose, but simply because the morning moved him along. Part 7: The Herb Garden Path. After leaving the refectory, Brother Edric turned not toward the chapel, but toward the garden, a slight detour he took most mornings. Though no one expected it of him. It wasn't part of his duties. It simply became part of his rhythm. The path to the herb garden was narrow, paved with uneven stones, each with its own small dip or crack. The grass between the stones held morning dew like tiny pearls. And when the sun crept higher, those drops would vanish without ceremony. The garden gate was made of thin, warped wood, barely more than a frame, and it never quite latched. Edric pushed it gently with 2 fingers, and it swung inward without sound. Inside, the herbs were still cloaked in shadow. Tall stalks of rosemary leaned in the cool air, their scent just beginning to wake. Low mounds of thyme and creeping mint clung to the earth, moisture clinging to their leaves. Lavender stood furthest back, still asleep in blue-gray. Edric didn't pick anything. He rarely did. Instead, he walked the short loop slowly, his hands tucked into his sleeves. He observed small things, a single curled leaf on the basil, a tiny crack in the stone border, the faintest track of a snail across the mossy edge of the well. He paused beside the raised bed of sage. It had been planted years ago by Brother Edric, who had since passed. The sage still grew wild, unruly, yet strong, a kind of quiet persistence Edric admired. There was no breeze. The air was still and damp, wrapped around the garden like a thick wool cloak. The only sound was the distant call of a bird beyond the cloister wall. He took one slow breath, then another. And then, without purpose or rush, he stepped back through the gate and onto the stone path, the morning following quietly behind him. Part 8: The Cloister Shadows. The sun was rising now, but it rose gently, as if it, too, understood the importance of a quiet beginning. Brother Edric stepped into the cloister walk, where the soft light spilled in at an angle, cutting between stone columns and casting long, slanted shadows across the tiled floor. The arches above him, familiar and worn, framed the stillness like the pages of a slow-turning book. The cloister walk was a square, a simple path that circled the small central garden, lined with trimmed grass and a modest sundial that had not been used in weeks. This was not a place for urgency. It was a place for presence. Edric's footsteps echoed faintly, a gentle pattern among the silence. He walked not to reach anything, but to pass through, to stretch his legs, to warm his thoughts, to watch the way sunlight met stone. Each arch he passed under gave a new angle to the garden, a new view of the same piece. At one corner, a spider's web had formed overnight, glistening with dew. Edric paused. The web stretched from the corner of a column to the base of an old bench. Delicate and perfect in its design. He leaned slightly closer, observing the tiny drops along the threads, suspended like beads in the early light. He did not disturb it. At the far side of the walk, he noticed a wooden broom resting against the wall, likely left behind by Brother Matthias the day before. Edric picked it up and leaned it neatly into a niche in the stone where tools were kept. It wasn't his task, but order was its own form of kindness. He continued walking, turning the final corner of the cloister walk, his pace as slow as the bells that still echoed in the distance. In the center of the garden, a single bird had landed, quiet, still, and watching. Part 9: The Quiet Chapel. Brother Edric reached the small side door of the chapel, the one most of the younger monks didn't use. The iron handle was cool to the touch, and the wood of the door gave slightly as he pressed it open. revealing the familiar hush inside. The chapel was lit only by the natural light that filtered through the narrow windows. These windows, long and arched, carried no stained glass, just clear panes, slightly warped with age, letting in sunlight that bent softly over the pews and onto the stone floor in quiet streaks. The air inside always smelled the same, a mix of old candles, dry wood, and something faintly mineral, like water left too long in a copper bowl. Edric stepped carefully across the floor, his sandals whispering against the stone. He took his usual seat, not in the front, nor the back, but on the third bench from the left, near a worn pillar with a barely visible crack running from top to base. He didn't pray aloud. He never did. He sat, eyes half lowered, breathing slowly. It was a moment not for asking or thanking, but simply for being, for resting within silence like a boat drifts upon still water. Behind him, he could hear the distant shuffle of another monk entering. Then a second. Neither made a sound. The flicker of a single candle, left lit from morning service, danced on the stone wall, its flame swaying faintly with each breath of air that passed through the gaps in the windows. The chapel held no ceremony just yet. That would come later. For now, there was only breath, stone, and the soft creak of wood as Brother Edric shifted slightly, folding his hands. And then he sat very still. Part 10. The library corridor. When Brother Edric left the chapel, the sun had climbed higher, casting a golden wash along the eastern corridor, the one that led to the monastery's small library. The floor here was warmer, baked gently by the morning light, and the stone walls held less of the dampness found in the older parts of the abbey. Dust drifted lazily through the air, visible only when it passed across the sunbeams stretching in from the tall windows. This corridor was quiet in a different way, not sacred like the chapel, nor practical like the bakery or refectory, but thoughtful. It was lined with shelves inset into the walls, not for books, but for small tools, dried herbs, ink jars, and small wooden boxes of mysterious origin, each labeled in a tidy, faded hand. Edric passed these slowly. His hands remained behind his back, fingers laced gently. He paused once to inspect a shelf where a stack of parchments had shifted slightly, as though a breeze had visited, though no windows opened in this wing. He straightened them, carefully aligning the edges, then continued on. To his left, a wooden bench rested beneath a window. The wood had worn smooth from use. A pale cushion, thin and patched, lay across it. No one sat there now. But Edric remembered a time when Brother Arnulf would read aloud there in the afternoons, his voice slow and measured like the ticking of a distant clock. The door to the library stood just ahead. It was never locked, only latched, a simple habit. Edric lifted the latch, soft metal on soft wood, and stepped inside. The smell was immediate: old paper, beeswax, dried glue, and the faint must of worn leather bindings. It was not unpleasant. It was, in its own way, comforting. He did not come to read. Not today. He came for the quiet, a kind of silence that felt even deeper among the shelves. He took a seat at the first table, near the center of the room. The light touched the tabletop in a wide, warm oval. He folded his hands again, not praying this time, just being. And the minutes passed, as they always did. Part 11. The scriptorium window. The scriptorium was never loud, even when every seat was filled and every hand was moving across parchment. It remained a place of hush and concentration, the kind of silence that seemed to breathe with the walls. Brother Edric entered through the side door, the same way he had for years. His presence didn't disturb anything. A few younger monks were already at their desks, heads bowed, quills scratching softly like wind brushing dried leaves. He made no effort to join them. His role in the scriptorium had shifted long ago, from one who wrote to one who simply watched. Near the far end of the room, by the window that faced the east field, stood an old wooden chair. It was not ornate. Its back was slightly crooked, and one leg was shorter than the others, so it wobbled just slightly when someone sat. Edric didn't mind. He had grown used to its particular rhythm. He lowered himself slowly onto the chair and folded his hands in his lap. Outside the window, the field glowed softly under the morning sun. A single crow hopped along the stone wall, pecked at nothing, then paused. A moment later, it flew off, not hurriedly, just as if it had remembered something it meant to do elsewhere. Edric rested his eyes on the edge of the sky. It was pale and smooth, almost cloudless, the kind of sky that didn't call attention to itself, but simply existed, steady and high. One of the monks sneezed softly behind him. Another adjusted a stool. A third paused his writing to stretch his fingers and gaze blankly at the inkpot. Edric remained still. The window's light crept across the floor, reaching slowly toward his feet. Dust hung in the air, not as a sign of neglect, but as a mark of age, of time passing in soft layers. The bell for midday prayers would not sound for a while. There was time still, and that was enough. Part 12. The midday bell. The sound came not as a shock, but as a gentle interruption, the soft tolling of the midday bell echoing through the stone corridors, calling the monks to pause, to gather, to breathe. Brother Edric lifted his head slightly at the first note. It was familiar, the way the tone lingered just a little longer on the second strike, as if the bell itself hesitated before continuing. He listened through the full sequence, not counting the rings, just letting them pass. Around him, the younger monks had already begun setting down their quills. One placed a thin sheet of parchment onto the drying rack. Another wiped his inkwell clean, careful not to spill a drop. The rustle of robes and quiet scraping of stools followed, all part of the daily rhythm. Edric stood slowly, his knees stiff but patient. He turned back to the corridor, passing once more through the rows of desks, nodding gently at those he passed. None spoke, they rarely did, but their eyes met his with brief, respectful acknowledgement. The corridor outside was brighter now. The sun had climbed above the roofline, and its light came straight through the windows, sharp and golden, warming the edges of the stone floor. As he walked, Edric let one hand drift along the wall beside him, fingertips brushing the uneven texture of old masonry, indentations, chips, tiny scratches made by hands long gone. He found this comforting. By the time he reached the refectory again, the room was already half full. The same long tables, the same benches, but now with bowls filled and bread sliced, steam rising gently from pots of broth placed at intervals down the line. He sat in the same place he always did, 3 seats from the left wall, facing the northern window. No one else had taken it. They never did. The silence remained, and yet, there was warmth in the room, in the scent of food, the closeness of others, the soft creak of the wood as monks shifted in their seats. Edric took a piece of bread. It was still warm in the center. Part 13. Bread, broth, and silence. Brother Edric took his time with each bite. The bread, though simple, had a crust that gave just the right resistance before yielding to a soft, pillowy middle. It was slightly uneven, likely the same batch he had carried that morning. A small, familiar satisfaction stirred in him as he recognized the shape of the loaf he had handled hours earlier. The broth, served in a ceramic bowl with a tiny chip near the rim, was little more than warm water steeped with leek, onion, and a hint of parsley. It wasn't meant to be rich. It was meant to nourish, gently, without indulgence. Each monk ate in silence. It was not enforced silence, but one of mutual understanding. Words during meals were reserved only for readings, and only on holy days. Today was not one of them. The occasional clink of a spoon or a shift of a bench echoed softly through the stone hall. The large windows were opened just slightly, allowing a slow breeze to move through, carrying with it the scent of herbs from the garden and the distant hum of bees. Brother Edric tore another piece of bread, dipped it lightly in the broth, and brought it to his lips. His hands moved slowly, deliberately. His gaze didn't wander. He wasn't watching anything in particular, only existing within the rhythm of the moment. Across from him, Brother Alwyn sneezed once, then bowed his head apologetically. No one reacted. It was understood. After the meal, each monk folded his napkin in the same way, once in half, then again, and placed it gently back into the wooden tray at the end of the table. They stood one by one, not all at once, and began to file out without instruction. Brother Edric remained seated for a few extra moments. Not for any reason. He simply liked to sit after meals, to let the quiet return to its deepest point before rising again. The breeze touched his cheek, and then, with the gentlest of movements, he stood, adjusted his robe, and followed the others out into the soft light of early afternoon. Part 14. Afternoon light in the courtyard. The courtyard always looked different in the afternoon, where the morning brought along delicate shadows that crept along the edges. The midday sun now poured directly into the square, flattening every surface in a warm, silent brightness. The stone benches had grown hot to the touch, and the gravel path sparkled faintly under the light. Brother Edric walked slowly along the path, not to reach any place in particular, but because walking was simply part of how the day passed. The grass in the center of the courtyard had been trimmed a few days prior. Small clippings still clung to the edge where the gravel met the green. The sundial stood still, casting a short shadow just past the hour mark, not that anyone truly consulted it anymore. A sparrow flitted from one end of the garden to the other, pausing briefly on the rim of the old stone basin. There was no water in it, only a dry bed of dust and a few leaves stirred by the breeze. The bird pecked at nothing, then flew off again, leaving the air just slightly disturbed. Near the northern wall, the vines had begun their slow climb upward. Edric paused to look at them. Ivy moved so slowly that one could forget it was moving at all. But year after year it crept upward, around cracks in the stone, across mortar lines, as patient as time itself. He placed his hand gently on the wall, warm from the sun, and then continued on. The only sound was the faint crunch of his sandals over the gravel. A sound barely louder than thought. In one corner of the courtyard, someone had left a broom leaning against a bench. Again, perhaps Brother Matthias. Edric did not move at this time. He simply glanced at it, nodded inwardly, and walked past. The sky above was cloudless. The heat was not uncomfortable, just still, heavy, as if encouraging the monks to slow down even further. Edric returned to the southern archway and stepped back into the shade of the cloister walk. Light faded from his robe. The world grew quiet again. Part 15. The old workshop door. Beyond the cloister, tucked near the western edge of the monastery grounds, was a small wooden door. It was low, narrow, and unremarkable, easy to pass by without a second glance. But Brother Edric never did. The door belonged to what was once the carpenter's workshop. Years ago, it had been a place of gentle hammering, the scent of cut wood, and the rhythmic rasp of the plane across pine. Now, it was quiet, not abandoned, simply resting. The door's latch stuck slightly when Edric opened it. As it always had, he leaned into it with practiced pressure, and the door gave way with a soft creak, like a yawn from something half asleep. Inside, dust hung lazily in the light that poured through a high, round window. Wooden benches stood along the walls, worn smooth by years of work. Tools, chisels, awls, mallets, still rested in place, each one nestled into its familiar spot as though waiting for the next hand to reach for them. Edric walked slowly across the room, his footsteps muffled by the old floorboards. He did not touch anything. He rarely did. Instead, he simply made his way to the far work table, the one by the window, and sat on the short stool left there by Brother Merrick. Long gone, on the table was a small, unfinished box. Its corners were dovetailed but unjoined. A fine layer of dust coated the lid. Edric looked at it, not with sadness or nostalgia, but with a soft kind of recognition, like seeing a name in a ledger you hadn't read in years. The silence here was different, not sacred like the chapel, nor communal like the refectory. It was the silence of stilled tools, of careful work paused indefinitely. Outside, a branch tapped lightly against the window. Edric remained for a time, watching the motes of dust turn slowly in the sunbeam, as if the air itself remembered how to move. Eventually, he stood, gave the door a gentle push closed behind him, and walked back into the warmth of the afternoon. Part 16. The walk to the orchard. The path to the orchard lay beyond the outer wall, through a narrow wooden gate that groaned faintly when pushed. It wasn't far. A gentle curve of worn earth and scattered pebbles led to a small grove of trees that had stood longer than most monks in the abbey had lived. Brother Edric walked there sometimes in the late afternoon. Not every day, and never with a particular purpose. It was simply one of those places where quiet gathered in its purest form. The trees in the orchard were not grand. Their trunks leaned in odd directions, their bark mottled with lichen, and their branches bore fruit only in modest amounts. But they stood peacefully, their leaves rustling in the gentlest of breezes, and their roots clung faithfully to the soil as though in conversation with it. Edric paused just inside the gate. The air here smelled faintly of dry grass, bark, and the soft sweetness of old apples still clinging to the farthest branches. He walked the short path that wound between the rows, not straight, not measured, just natural. Beneath his feet, the fallen leaves crunched quietly. Some were curled and brown. Others still held hints of green, reluctant to let go of the season. Near the third tree, he stopped. A bench, little more than a plank set between two stones, waited beneath the shade. He sat. The wood was uneven but familiar, warmed by the sun on one side and cool on the other. Birdsong floated lazily through the branches, distant, irregular, like a melody half remembered. A bee passed by without urgency. Insects hummed softly among the grass. Edric closed his eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to listen. The orchard didn't ask anything of him. It simply allowed him to be. When he opened his eyes again, the light had shifted, golden now. Longer shadows. The hour moved on, gently and without sound. He stood, pressed a hand to the nearest tree in brief farewell, and turned back toward the path. Part 17. Folding robes and faint breezes. By the time Brother Edric returned to the monastery grounds, the light had mellowed. The hard brightness of afternoon had softened into a muted gold that spilled gently along the stone walls. Shadows no longer stretched, they lingered. He re-entered through the small arch near the laundry cloister, a quiet space lined with wooden racks and sun-warmed stones. There, robes were often hung or folded, depending on the day and the weather. Today, the breeze had been kind enough to dry the fabric evenly. A single line of brown robes swayed gently on a rope tied between two iron hooks. They moved just slightly, like monks bowing in silent rhythm, touched by the faint wind that passed through. Edric approached a low wooden bench where several dry robes had been folded already. They sat in quiet stacks, sleeves tucked neatly inward, hems aligned, not as a matter of precision, but of respect. He picked one up and smoothed the crease down its back, then folded it once more before placing it with the others. The scent of linen soap lingered, softened now by sun and wind. Occasionally, a small feather or blade of grass would be caught in a fold, reminders that even the most careful processes had company from the world outside. He moved slowly from one end of the bench to the other. Hands steady, the breeze lifted a corner of one robe slightly, then let it fall again with a whisper. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, but the sound felt far away, dulled by the thickness of stone walls. There was no schedule for this task, no need to finish by a certain hour. It would be done when it was done, and it was nearly done now. Edric sat for a moment at the end of the bench, elbows on his knees, looking out at the courtyard beyond. A few petals from the garden had drifted near the door, resting on the stone like confetti from a celebration no one remembered having. He exhaled softly and stood, brushing his hands lightly on his robe, not to clean them, but just to mark the end of a quiet task. Part 18. The lamp room. As the light began to dim, Brother Edric made his way to a small room near the western hall, a space known simply as the lamp room. It wasn't large, just wide enough for a table, a shelf, and a narrow window that rarely let in more than a soft glow at sunset. The air inside always smelled faintly of beeswax and linen wicks, with a deeper undertone of old oil and cool stone. The lamps were modest, small clay bowls fitted with short, curled wicks, and a handle at one end for easy carrying. Each one bore tiny imperfections, a chip on the rim, a fingerprint indentation in the clay, a stain that had never fully come out. Edric knew them all. This was the time of day when the lamps were checked, not yet lit, but made ready. A fresh wick here, a little more oil there, a cloth laid out in case of drips. Brother Edric picked up a flask from the shelf and tilted it gently into the first lamp. The oil moved slowly, catching the low light from the window and reflecting it in ripples. He didn't rush. No one would need the lamps for another hour, maybe more, but preparing them early gave him a small piece. He moved from lamp to lamp with quiet hands. Occasionally, he would wipe the rim with a cloth or straighten a wick that had curled too tightly. His fingers moved with certainty, not fast, not slow, just practiced, like a rhythm remembered from a song long ago. Outside, the sun had dipped low enough that the shadows on the walls stretched nearly to the ceiling. A single ray still filtered in through the high window, touching the edge of the table where the lamps now sat in their quiet row. Edric stepped back and looked at them. They were not beautiful, but they were clean, full, and waiting. He closed the flask, folded the cloth, and placed both on the shelf. Then he turned, the soles of his sandals whispering against the stone, and stepped out into the hallway where the light had already begun to fade. Part 19. Shadows along the wall. The halls of the monastery grew quieter as the sun lowered behind the hills. Though the silence had been present all day, there was something different about it now, something fuller, rounder, like a cup slowly filling with stillness. Brother Edric walked the inner corridor toward the western wall, where the last light of day poured through a long, narrow window. It wasn't much, just a soft beam that stretched diagonally across the stones, painting them in soft hues of amber and gray. He paused where the light fell, not in the middle of it, but just at its edge, letting the warmth touch the hem of his robe and the side of his hand. The stones here had always been slightly smoother, worn from the passing of countless hands, and the wind, and time itself. On the wall beside him was a small shelf. It held nothing of importance, just a single wooden box with a missing lid and a folded scrap of cloth tucked inside. No one seemed to know why it was there, or who had placed it, but it had remained for years, untouched, except for the occasional soft brush of passing robes. Edric lifted the cloth slightly with 2 fingers. Beneath it, a small stone sat, flat, smooth, the kind a child might skip across water. He set the cloth back exactly as it had been. Above the shelf, the wall bore a long crack, barely visible in most light, but now, with the sun's beam striking it just right, it was clear, a long thread of shadow stretching from the floor nearly to the ceiling. Like a seam in the fabric of the abbey itself. He traced it gently with his eyes, not following it to its end, but lingering in its middle, as though the crack held a quiet story only the building knew. In the distance, a bell gave a single chime, not the bell for prayer. Just a soft note to mark the hours passing. Brother Edric stood a moment longer, then turned slowly, leaving the shelf, the shadow, and the lingering warmth behind. The light would be gone soon. Part 20. Evening beneath the eaves. By the time Brother Edric stepped into the covered walk that ran along the edge of the inner courtyard, the last of the light was beginning to leave the sky. The clouds above had taken on the color of worn parchment, tinged with soft lavender and gray, as if the day were folding itself gently away. He moved slowly beneath the wooden eaves. The roof above creaked faintly in the cooling air, and every few steps, a small drop of water from some earlier rain found its way down one of the beams and landed softly on the stone path. This walk had always been his favorite in the evening. It offered a view of the courtyard, but with shelter, a place between inside and out, between motion and stillness, the perfect place, he thought, for endings. The grass in the garden looked darker now, as if it too had grown tired. A few birds lingered on the edges, preening slowly, then hopping once or twice before disappearing into the hedges. Brother Edric paused near the southern arch, his hands folded loosely in front of him. A faint breeze passed through the columns, tugging gently at the edge of his robe. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and earth. Across the courtyard, a small window glowed faintly. Someone had lit a lamp in the dormitory. Soon, more would follow, one by one, until the whole abbey was quietly dotted with warm light. But not yet. For now, the in-between remained, the soft hush of day becoming night. The stillness between footsteps, the breath between thoughts. Brother Edric sat on the low stone bench beneath the arch. He leaned back slightly against the wall, exhaling through his nose, not with effort, but with release. He would stay just a few minutes longer, until the sky let go completely. Part 21. Lighting the first lamp. Darkness had not arrived all at once. It crept in, quietly, patiently, like a guest who knew its place and waited to be noticed. By the time Brother Edric rose from the stone bench, the sky had turned the color of cooled iron, and the distant trees beyond the wall had faded into soft silhouettes. Only the western edge of the abbey still held a faint glow. And even that was thinning, like breath on cold glass. He walked the corridor without hurry, his steps soft and steady. The quiet was deeper now. Even the birds had gone still. There were no bells this hour, no spoken prayers, just the hush of stone, wood, and breath. Reaching the lamp room, Edric opened the door with a careful hand. Inside, The lamps stood waiting, as he had left them earlier. Clean and filled, resting in a neat row upon the table. He picked one up, the third from the left. The one with the small chip near the handle. He carried it to the wall, where a slender taper waited in a brass holder. With practiced motion, he struck flint to steel. A spark, then another. On the third try, the taper caught, its flame small but sure. He touched it to the wick. The lamp came to life, not suddenly, but softly, a bloom of golden light that warmed the shadows around it. He held it for a moment, letting the flame steady itself. Then, slowly, he carried it through the hallway, pausing at each window and turning into the small prayer alcoves where other lamps waited to be lit. One by one, he touched wick to flame. The light grew, not quickly, not brightly, but with the calm presence of something meant to be there. The abbey was not dark now. It was quiet and warm. And behind him, small pools of light trailed through the corridor like footsteps made of fire. Part 22. The sound of wooden floors. The corridors of the abbey were lit now, not with brilliance, but with soft pools of light that wavered gently against the stone walls. The flames from the lamps did not flicker much, there was little breeze inside. Only the occasional creak from somewhere far off, or the faint sigh of timber settling in the ceiling beams. Brother Edric walked with a calm rhythm, the lamp held low in his left hand. His right occasionally brushed the wall beside him, a habit, more than anything else, to feel the curve of the mortar joints, the texture of time pressed into stone. He turned into the southern wing, the oldest part of the monastery. Here, the floors were wooden, laid down so long ago that no board lay flat anymore. They rose and dipped in soft waves, like the sea frozen in motion. Some boards groaned softly under his step, not with protest, but with familiarity. Each creak had its own note, some long and slow, others brief, almost like whispers. Edric knew them all. He walked lightly, not to avoid the sounds, but to appreciate them. A moth passed near the lamp, fluttering silently before vanishing into shadow. He reached the narrow window at the end of the hall and paused. Outside, the courtyard was dim now, its corners softened by night. One of the prayer candles had been left on near the far arch, its glow small, but persistent. He set the lamp gently onto the ledge, just beside the window, and leaned forward a bit, resting his hands on the stone. The air near the glass was cooler. He could see his own faint reflection, blurred and ghost-like against the darkened glass. The wood beneath his feet shifted slightly as he leaned, but he didn't move. He liked the way the boards spoke when asked nothing of them. Somewhere behind him, a door closed, slowly, firmly, and then the monastery was still again, save for the sound of Brother Edric's breath, and the quiet groan of wood in the deepening dark. Part 23. A visit to the well. As the hallway dimmed behind him, Brother Edric turned toward the outer courtyard once more, not for prayer, nor for duty, but for something quieter, a habit, a pause. At the far edge of the grounds, near the low garden wall, stood the old stone well. It was not used often now. A newer water source had been built closer to the kitchen. But the well remained, unmoved, unchanged, as if content with being remembered. The path to it was paved with uneven stones, some worn smooth, others cracked, all of them familiar. The night air had cooled enough that the grass on either side whispered when touched by wind. Edric carried the lamp in both hands now, not because it was heavy, but because it deserved the attention. The flame danced gently behind its glass, casting golden arcs along his robe as he walked. When he reached the well, he set the lamp on its stone rim. The well's pulley creaked softly in the breeze, though the bucket hung still, its rope knotted and dry. He did not draw water. He did not look down. Instead, he sat on the low bench nearby, a curved plank of oak, darkened by years of dew and sun, shaped by use rather than design. Above him, the sky had cleared. A scattering of stars had begun to reveal themselves, each one quiet and distant, like the soft eyes of 1,000 old monks watching gently from beyond. The air smelled of damp earth, moss, and the faint scent of rosemary carried from the garden wall. Crickets chirped with soft irregularity. Nothing loud, nothing sharp. Brother Edric leaned back slightly, folding his hands in his lap. The flame in the lamp flickered once, then steadied. He would not stay long, just enough to notice that the night had arrived, and that it had done so without hurry. without need for ceremony. Just the way it always had. Part 24. Returning the lamp. Brother Edric rose from the bench beside the well with a familiar slowness, not from fatigue, but from the quiet understanding that no moment in the day should be rushed. Especially the last ones. He took the lamp once more into his hands. Its flame was lower now. Just a small teardrop of gold swaying gently behind the glass. Still warm. Still enough. The walk back to the monastery was darker than before. The path remained the same. But the shadows had grown. They pressed in softly from the hedges and cloister walls. Not ominous. Just close, as if the night wished to walk beside him. The door to the west hall stood open. A faint creak sounded as he passed through, and his sandals brushed lightly against the stone, the only sounds in a corridor that had already begun to forget the day. Inside the lamp room, everything waited just as he had left it. The other lamps were out now, or nearly so. Only the one in his hands still glowed. He placed it carefully on the table, in the same spot it had sat that morning. Now dimmer, quieter, a mirror of the day itself. Then he removed the glass cover, pinched the wick gently between his fingers, and snuffed the flame with a soft twist. A thin thread of smoke curled upward, then faded. Darkness settled, but it was not unwelcome. It wrapped around the room like an old robe, comforting, familiar, complete. Edric stood still for a moment longer, letting the absence of light fill the space around him. There was nothing left to do. He closed the door behind him with a soft hand, and the monastery, once again, held its breath in silence. Part 25. The cell and the straw mattress. Brother Edric's cell was not far from the lamp room, just 3 turns down a narrowing corridor, past a wooden cabinet that had been missing its handle for over a decade, and under a low arch where taller monks always had to duck. Edric never did. He didn't need to bring a lamp. The way was etched in his mind, and the faint glow from a single candle, left burning at the far end of the hallway, was enough to catch the curve of the walls and the edge of the floor. His door was as simple as the rest, plain wood, iron hinges, and a latch that lifted with the lightest touch. No lock, no sound. Inside, everything remained as it always had. A small bed of straw and linen, a basin for water, a peg for his robe, a stool, a small wooden cross above the headboard, carved by a hand long gone and never replaced. He removed his sandals and placed them neatly by the foot of the bed. His robe followed, folded, not precisely, but with care, and draped over the stool. The mattress gave softly as he sat. It was uneven in places, and the straw had flattened in the middle over the years. But Edric didn't notice. He had slept on it through every season, through storm and calm, feast and fast. It knew him as well as anything ever could. He lay down slowly, arms resting across his chest. Outside, the wind stirred faintly against the wooden shutter. Inside, nothing moved. The candle in the hall guttered, then steadied. Edric let out a quiet breath, not a sigh. Just the final note of a day fully lived. The monastery was still, the darkness complete, and the silence, at last, whole. Part 26. The first breath of morning. Before the first bell, before the sun, before even the birds, there was a moment, brief, but certain, when the entire monastery held itself in a soft and perfect stillness. It was not the stillness of sleep, but the kind that comes just before waking. A breath, drawn but not yet exhaled. In his cell, Brother Edric opened his eyes. No sound had called him. No movement stirred the corridor beyond. His body simply knew, as it had for decades. The air in the room was cooler than it had been the night before. Not cold, just touched by the weight of dawn. A blanket of quiet clung to the stone walls, and the straw mattress still held a trace of his warmth. He sat up without hurry. The floor was cool beneath his feet. His robe, folded over the stool beside him, felt heavier in the dimness, as though it, too, had been resting deeply. Outside the small shuttered window, the sky had begun its slow turn from black to blue. Not yet light, but no longer night. A gentle blur, soft as ash, edged with the faintest silver. He dressed in silence, every motion familiar, every fold known. When he moved to the basin and poured water into the clay bowl, it splashed softly, the sound delicate and hollow in the morning hush. Edric cupped the water and brought it to his face. It was cold, sharper than he expected. He closed his eyes and let the sensation pass through him, not shocking. Just honest. He dried his hands on a worn cloth and folded it carefully back into place. Then, with a final glance around the small room, not to check, but simply to see, he stepped into the corridor. The monastery had not yet stirred. And the first bell was still waiting. Part 27. The corridor before the bell. The corridor stretched ahead, still wrapped in blue-gray shadow, lit only by the faintest reflection of the sky through the narrow slit windows. The stone beneath Brother Edric's feet was cool, but familiar, like the touch of a well-worn coat in early spring. He walked slowly, not because of age or stiffness, but because there was no reason to walk quickly. The monastery moved on its own time, a rhythm older than any of its inhabitants, and slower than memory. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wax. Somewhere far off, the scent of yesterday's bread lingered in the corners of the stone. The walls, rough in some places and smooth in others, carried traces of passing generations. Hands brushed here, shoulders leaned there, sandals scuffed softly along the edge. As he passed the chapel door, Edric paused, not to enter, but simply to stand beside it. His fingers rested briefly on the worn wooden frame. He listened, not for voices or prayers, but for silence, and silence was what he found. Far ahead, at the bend in the hall, a shaft of light had begun to stretch across the floor, not direct sunlight, but the earliest glow reflecting off the garden walls. It moved so slowly one might never notice it, unless they had walked that hallway every morning for 30 years. Edric continued. He passed the storage alcove, where folded linens were stacked neatly in their cubbies. He passed the old sundial mounted on the interior wall, useless in the dark but never removed. He passed the broom closet, where the same squeaky hinge greeted him as it had every day for as long as he could remember. And still, no bell. He liked this part of the day, the corridor before the bell. The quiet before the rhythm began. It was like the moment before breath. He walked on. Part 28. The bell. Once more, Brother Edric reached the base of the bell tower just as the light outside began to shift from silver to pale gold, the kind of gold that didn't shine, but simply arrived, like a memory long buried under snow. The door to the tower stood half ajar. It always did. The hinge no longer closed flush, and no one had bothered to repair it. Edric had never asked them to. He stepped inside and was met by the familiar stillness of the stone spiral stair, coiled like the slow breath of the abbey itself. The air was cooler here, touched by the night that had yet to fully leave. He began to climb. The steps welcomed his sandals with soft, uneven thuds. Some had been worn hollow in the middle, others chipped along the edge. His hand brushed the stone wall as he ascended, his fingers following the same trail they had each morning for decades. At the midpoint landing, he paused, as he always did, outside the narrow tower window. The orchard lay quiet. Its bare trees still held the color of night, but the mist that clung to their roots had begun to rise, slowly, like breath from sleeping earth. He did not linger long. The climb resumed. The stair creaked in a rhythm older than him. The air thinned as the height increased, and the ceiling grew closer with each turn. At last, he reached the belfry. The bell hung, motionless, as though it, too, had just awakened. Its surface bore the color of ash and old bronze. A spider's thread, faint as hair, trailed from its rim to the wooden beam above. The rope hung loosely in the center of the tower, coiled slightly at the bottom, like a sleeping cat. Brother Edric stood in front of it for a moment, hands at his sides. He looked not at the bell, but at the light coming through the slats, fractured lines that painted the floor in mourning stripes. Then, without a word, he reached for the rope. He pulled, not hard, just enough. The bell gave a single, round note. It echoed gently down the tower and out into the monastery grounds, touching each wall, each window, each still sleeping soul, with a sound that said, "The day has begun." He waited. Then, once more, he pulled. Part 29. Slow steps downward. The second chime of the bell faded more slowly than the first, its hum settling into the bones of the tower like warm breath on cool stone. Brother Edric stood for a moment longer, the rope resting gently against his hand, no longer pulled, but not yet released. Then he let it go. It swung back into place with no sound. The bell, satisfied with its announcement, hung still once more, its message delivered not in urgency, but in rhythm, a beginning, not a command. The morning had started. Brother Edric turned toward the steps. The descent was always slower than the climb, not out of caution, but out of respect. The stairwell was narrow, and each footfall gave a hollow sound, as if the stones were gently answering him with every movement. His hands slid along the curved wall as he walked. The coolness of the stone had not yet faded, though sunlight had begun its steady approach outside. Halfway down, he paused again, not because he needed to, but because he always did. The narrow window on this landing gave a view to the northern field, where the grass still glistened faintly with dew. No wind stirred it yet. The trees stood as still as monuments, awaiting the breeze. He remained for a breath, then moved on. At the bottom of the stairs, the door stood just as he had left it, open a few inches. A line of light drawn across the floor like a bookmark left in a well-read chapter. He stepped through it. In the corridor beyond, a quiet motion had begun. Faint footsteps from another wing. The soft creak of a door being opened. The rustle of robes shaken out from pegs. Brother Edric continued down the hall. The abbey was awakening, but gently, as it always had. Part 30. The same table, the same bread. By the time Brother Edric reached the refectory, the first rays of true sunlight had spilled across the floor, stretching thin golden fingers across the worn stones. Dust hung gently in the beams of light, not hurried, not still, simply turning, as if time itself had been ground into fine powder. The long tables were set just as they had been the morning before. And the morning before that. Wooden bowls placed precisely at each seat. Loaves of bread laid out in modest piles. Nothing extravagant, nothing different. And yet, everything felt just a little new. Edric moved to his usual place, third bench from the left, facing the small window that overlooked the herb wall. The bench gave its familiar creak as he lowered himself onto it. His knees acknowledged the motion with a soft ache, one he no longer minded. Across the room, Brother Tomas entered, holding the first pot of warm broth. He gave no greeting. None was needed. A nod was exchanged, slow, steady, like the swing of a pendulum, and then he went about his task. The others followed shortly after. Sandals on stone, the soft sweep of cloth. No chatter, no rush, just the monastery settling into its well-practiced rhythm. Edric reached for a piece of bread. The crust was warm, the center, soft, the same bread, the same hands had prepared it, the same table had received it. And yet, this morning, it felt slightly more alive. Not because anything had changed, but because nothing had. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and looked out the window. A small bird had landed on the edge of the herb trough. Its feathers puffed, its eyes blinking into the new light. It pecked at something unseen, then flew off again, soundless. Edric swallowed, placed the bread down gently, and let his hands rest on the table's edge. It was a new day. And like every day, it began in silence, in repetition, in peace. Part 31. The room with the broken window latch. After the morning meal, when most had gone to the garden or chapel, Brother Edric took a quiet turn down a less used corridor near the scriptorium. The floor here was uneven, made of older stones that had shifted just slightly over the years, like pages in a thick book left out in the rain. At the end of the hallway was a small room, square, plain, with a single desk, a stool, and a narrow window that faced the orchard. It had once been a novice's study, but no one had used it formally for years. The window latch had broken long ago. It no longer sealed shut, but instead of being repaired, it had been left as it was, not forgotten, just accepted. The wind moved through it gently now, lifting the edge of a faded curtain that never fully stayed still. Brother Edric stepped inside, not with purpose, but with familiarity. He came here often in the quiet moments between bells. Not to read, not to write, simply to sit. He placed his hand on the wooden stool, checking for dust. There was always a little, but never enough to matter. He sat. From this seat, the orchard could be seen clearly. The trees swayed slowly in the early light, leaves turning just slightly, not in wind, but as if stretching. A bird flew low along the garden wall. Then another. Then nothing for a while. The curtain drifted again. On the desk lay a sheet of parchment, blank, except for a faded ink blot in the corner, dried into a shape that resembled a crooked star. Edric traced its edge with one finger. He did not speak. He did not move again. The room was still, save for the curtain's rise and fall, and the soft creak of the stool beneath him. The broken latch let the air in, and that was enough. Part 32. Dust on the shelf. The shelf was not remarkable. Just 4 narrow planks of wood nailed into the stone wall of the old study. A little crooked from the unevenness of the masonry behind them. No labels, no titles, no symmetry. Only a quiet arrangement of things left in place by hands that had long since moved on. Brother Edric remained seated, still watching the orchard through the open window. But after a time, he turned his head slightly and let his eyes settle on the shelf. The top level held a wooden box with no lid, filled with yellowed scraps of parchment folded at odd angles. Some had faint writing, most had faded entirely. One piece near the front had curled so tightly at the edge that it resembled a scroll, but it wasn't. Just time's quiet work. The second shelf had an old inkwell. Dried, empty, its neck chipped, its base stained with rings. Beside it, a quill with a split nib rested, still bearing the faintest tint of brown. It would no longer write, but no one had thrown it away. On the third shelf sat a small stone, smooth, gray, warm-looking despite the cold. Next to it was a folded cloth. Edric didn't know what it had been used for. He didn't need to. The bottom shelf was nearly bare, save for a tiny dish made of fired clay. It was chipped along one side, and inside it rested a single button. Wooden, cracked, from a robe, perhaps, or something else. It didn't matter. He stood slowly and approached the shelf. Not to touch, just to observe. He leaned in slightly. Dust had gathered thickest along the back edge. But it wasn't unpleasant. It lay like a soft blanket, undisturbed, settled with age and patience. Edric breathed in, a slow, steady breath, and let the faint scent of paper, ink, and wood fill his lungs. Then he stepped back. Nothing had changed. And yet, for a moment, he felt as though he had visited something deeply personal, not of another, but of the monastery itself. Part 33. Down the garden path again. The door to the old study creaked faintly as Brother Edric pulled it closed. He did not latch it. He never did. The door always settled on its own, slowly easing into the frame until it stopped with a soft click, not precise, not secure, just enough. He turned down the corridor, his sandals brushing the stone floor in a rhythm only he could hear. Outside, the sun had risen high enough to warm the courtyard walls. Shadows had shortened, and the sky had taken on that pale, forgiving color it always wore before midday, neither vibrant nor dull, but steady. Edric stepped into the garden path once more, this time not in search of anything. The herbs stirred slightly in the breeze, rosemary, lavender, and mint, though none of them grew in neat rows anymore. They had softened at the edges, spreading into one another like old conversations overlapping with time. He moved slowly along the edge of the plot. Bees hovered lazily above the flowers, uninterested in haste. A butterfly passed near his shoulder, then drifted toward the fig tree in the corner of the wall. The stones beneath his feet were warm now, their uneven surfaces rounded from generations of walking. Between them, small tufts of moss had taken root, bright and tender. Brother Edric paused near the ivy-covered wall, where the wooden bench sat shaded and cracked. He did not sit. He merely stood near it, gazing at a cluster of violets pushing through a gap in the mortar. No one had planted them. They simply appeared every year, not many. Not bold, just enough to be noticed by those who looked closely. He looked closely. The breeze shifted again. And in that quiet moment, beneath a sun neither harsh nor dim, Brother Edric felt exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because of duty, not because of purpose, but because it was morning, and the garden path existed, and he had chosen to walk it. Part 34. The drying line. The cloths had already been hung. Brother Edric noticed them as he passed the narrow opening between the herb garden and the southern wall, a passage that led to a small courtyard rarely used by anyone except Brother Tomas and, on occasion, the wind, stretched across the courtyard, between 2 low posts, was a simple rope line. Upon it, several towels, napkins, and robes swayed gently, some pale with age, some newer but softened by many washings. He approached quietly, his hands tucked within his sleeves. The sun had warmed the linen. He could smell it, faint traces of water, soap, and the unmistakable scent of time well spent in the open air. A cloth at the far end had folded itself partially over the line in the breeze. Edric stepped forward and gently lifted the corner back into place. It wasn't necessary, but it felt right. Nearby, a wooden table stood, worn and slanted from years of standing in one place. A wicker basket rested atop it, half filled with folded items. A robe with a missing hem stitch. 2 aprons, and what looked like a very small bedsheet, perhaps once meant for a novice's cell. He didn't fold anything. He simply stood beside the basket, watching the linen move in the breeze, slow, back and forth, like a conversation spoken in sighs. Overhead, a cloud passed across the sun. The light dimmed slightly, and the air cooled. A moment later, the sun returned, and with it, the warmth. The cloths moved again, as if agreeing with the change. Brother Edric stayed for a few more minutes, then turned toward the arch that led back to the cloister. He did not look back. He didn't need to. The linen would continue drying, with or without him. Part 35. A cup of water from the stone basin. The stone basin stood beneath the cloister arch, half in shadow, half in sun, exactly where it had always stood, against the wall that never dried entirely in winter, and always bloomed with faint moss by spring. Brother Edric stepped toward it slowly. The basin was shallow, carved from a single block of stone. Its rim was smooth from countless hands resting on it, washing, cupping, pausing. Water still filled it, refreshed each morning from the kitchen pump. Cool and clean. No one spoke around the basin. It was not a place for conversation. It was for rinsing, for relief, for small silences between tasks. Edric dipped a wooden cup into the water and brought it to his lips. The water was cool, not cold. Not startling, just enough to remind his mouth of morning. He drank slowly. He always had. Around him, the air had begun to change. It was not quite the heat of noon, but the light had shifted, brighter now. Flatter against the floor, reaching into corners where the early sun could not. A bird landed briefly on the edge of the basin, then flew off again without making a sound. A leaf fell from nowhere and floated gently across the surface of the water. Edric set the cup back in its place, a small niche in the wall, carved long ago and darkened by time. He adjusted its angle slightly so it sat flush with the edge. No one would notice, but he would. He remained there for a moment, watching the ripples in the basin settle, one by one, until the water returned to glass. Then, without a word, he stepped back beneath the arch and continued walking. The basin would wait for someone else. Part 36. Shadows beneath the fig tree. There was a fig tree near the southern wall of the garden, not tall, not wide, but comfortably shaped, like a folded blanket at the foot of a well-made bed. It had stood there for many years, never yielding much fruit, but always offering shade. Brother Edric found himself beneath it more often in recent years. By the time he reached it, the sunlight had grown strong, and the branches above filtered it gently through broad leaves, casting layered shadows across the ground. The shapes shifted only slightly in the breeze, slow, thoughtful movements, like gestures from an old friend. He sat on the low bench beneath the tree, one hand resting on the wood, the other folded over his robe. The bench creaked softly beneath his weight. It always had. The sound was not unpleasant, just another voice in the quiet language of the garden. The wall behind him radiated warmth, having absorbed the sun all morning. A faint scent of fig bark lingered in the air, mixed with the deeper smell of dry earth and summer dust. Across the garden, a row of lavender nodded gently. A bee hovered above it, then dipped and vanished behind the stone border. Brother Edric closed his eyes. Not to sleep, not yet, but to listen. To the leaves, to the distant rustle of someone walking with careful steps, to the far-off splash of water being poured into a basin, to the wind touching the world in the smallest ways. He breathed slowly. Somewhere near his feet, a small pebble shifted. Nothing else moved, and the shadows beneath the fig tree stretched just a little farther, not because they needed to, but because it was time. Part 37. The wooden spoon drawer. The kitchen was nearly empty by late morning. Brother Edric stepped inside quietly, as he often did after his time in the garden. Not to help. His duties no longer called for stirring pots or grinding herbs, but to observe the warmth, the scent, and the particular stillness that existed between one task and the next. The fire had been reduced to embers. A blackened pot sat cooling on the hearth. A cloth had been left draped over a bowl near the window, rising slightly with each soft breath of air that passed through the open shutters. He walked past the chopping block, past the rows of neatly hung ladles and strainers, and came to a small wooden drawer tucked beneath the counter. The drawer was shallow. It didn't slide smoothly. It groaned just a little when pulled, not from age, but from familiarity, like a stool that learns to lean with the shape of the one who always sits on it. Inside were spoons. Wooden spoons of all shapes and sizes, some long and thin, others short and round-headed. A few had burn marks. One had a crack sealed with twine. All had been used, scrubbed, dried, and returned to this drawer for longer than anyone could remember. Brother Edric didn't need one, but he picked one up anyway, a broad, flat spoon with a slight curve and a faded stain near the handle. He turned it slowly in his hand. It was warm from the sun that had crept across the counter. The grain of the wood was smooth from countless fingers. It felt more like memory than tool. He set it back gently, nestling it between its neighbors. The drawer made a small sound as it closed, a hushed, wooden exhale. He stood for another moment in the kitchen's quiet hum, then turned back toward the hallway, leaving behind only the scent of rosemary, warm air, and the drawer full of spoons. Part 38: The empty inkpot. The scriptorium was quiet in a way only certain rooms could be, not just absent of sound, but full of intentional stillness, as if even the air had learned not to disturb the hands that moved across parchment. Brother Edric entered through the narrow wooden door, which was never locked and never wide open. It always rested half closed, like an old thought waiting to be finished. Most of the desks were empty now. The morning copying had ended, and the young monks had returned to their other tasks. Only 2 desks remained occupied, one by a younger scribe slowly arranging quills by length, and another by a lamp that had not been lit. Edric made his way to the far wall, where an old writing station sat unused. The surface was uneven and stained, the legs slightly uneven, but it had always stood steady enough. Atop the desk sat a single inkpot. Its rim was dry and flaked. The bottom had collected a thin ring of hardened residue, dark, like dried figs. No quill rested beside it. No parchment waited for words. It was simply there, empty, and entirely at peace with its emptiness. Brother Edric picked it up and turned it in his hand. It was ceramic, cool, and surprisingly light. The base had been etched with a tiny cross, likely carved by a novice during his first weeks at the abbey. Full of purpose and care. The mark was almost gone now, rubbed faint by decades of fingers. He held the inkpot for a moment longer, then set it gently back in its place. He did not think about refilling it. Some things, he knew, were meant to be full again. Others were meant to rest. And this one was already doing its part. Part 39: Folding the candle wicks. In the small storage room beside the chapel, a room too narrow for more than one person to stand comfortably, there was a basket of candle wicks. It sat on a low shelf, tucked between 2 clay jars of wax and a wooden box filled with stubby candle ends. All neatly organized, but not labeled. The basket itself was woven tightly, faded at the rim, and carried the faint scent of old linen, oil, and time. Brother Edric stepped into the room with a slight bend of the shoulders, not from age, but from the ceiling, which had always been too low. The stone floor was colder here, and the air had that particular stillness that comes from a place few people visit unless needed. He knelt beside the basket. Inside were dozens of wicks, cut, coiled, and half-curled from waiting. Some had been laid flat between cloths. Others looped loosely like sleeping threads. They were pale, almost white, and slightly stiff from the wax that had soaked into them during their making. He began to fold, not out of necessity. The candles would not be made until the end of the week, but because he enjoyed the motion. One fold in half, one fold again, the curve of the fiber tugged gently. Not creased, not forced, each one nestled against the next like quiet words on a page. The room said nothing. The shelves did not shift. The walls held their silence like a hymn sung once and still echoing. Outside, the chapel bells did not ring. Not yet. The wicks continued to pile, soft and weightless. Edric paused, his hands resting on the edge of the basket. A beam of late daylight had crept into the room through the high, narrow window. It touched the corner of the floor, not quite reaching him, but close enough to warm the edge of his sleeve. He folded one last wick, then stood, slowly, quietly, as if the air around him had begun to dream. Part 40. When the floor cools. Evening arrived quietly. There was no announcement, no sudden change, only the gentle shift of light, from golden to gray, to the soft color of stone just before sleep. Brother Edric stood in the hallway outside his cell. The lamps had not yet been lit. The corridor held the dimness of transition, not yet night, but no longer part of the day. That space between hours, where thoughts seem to stretch and sounds seem farther away than they are. He stepped slowly inside. His room was unchanged. Of course it was. The bed still tucked neatly against the wall. The basin still dry. The folded robe waiting on the stool. But what marked the evening most was the floor. It had cooled. Where that morning it had offered a slight warmth from sun and memory, it now felt smoother, flatter, more still. A surface no longer carrying the weight of footsteps, but resting beneath them. He sat on the edge of the bed. A breeze passed through the window slit, bringing with it a thread of cool air scented faintly with lavender and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, someone coughed once. A door clicked. Then silence resumed its place. Brother Edric folded his hands in his lap. He did not think of tomorrow. He did not recall the details of the day. He simply sat in a room that had seen many days, and let it see one more come to rest. Eventually, he lay down. The mattress gave with its usual sigh, and the pillow welcomed him as it had for years, without pride, without need. His eyes remained open for a while. Then they closed. The floor cooled beneath him, and the monastery, once again, returned to quiet.